The Whistler in the Pines. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. A group of 4 friends, eager to escape the buzz of the city, decided to camp deep in the heart of an isolated forest. There were no marked trails, no rangers, just miles of dense pines that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The first night passed quietly. They gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. But as the fire dwindled, a strange sound broke the serenity, a sharp, high-pitched whistle, like the wind through a cracked window. At first, they dismissed it. Probably just the wind, one of them said. But as the night wore on, the sound grew louder and more distinct. It was no longer the wind, but a deliberate, human-like whistle, sharp and eerie. "Who's messing around with us?" one of the friends called out into the darkness, but the others just shrugged, nervously laughing. The whistling continued, now moving closer. It sounded like it was circling their camp. One by one, they turned off their flashlights, staring into the woods, trying to locate the source. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whistling stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. They all agreed to go to bed early, but sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the tent, every rustle in the trees, made them jump. Hours passed before they could finally drift off. In the morning, they woke to find a disturbing sight, a line of strange, deliberate footprints, deep, wide marks, leading straight up to their tent. They looked at each other in confusion. They hadn't heard anyone approach during the night. They packed up their gear quickly and decided to cut their trip short. But as they made their way back to the car, the whistling started again. Faint at first, then louder, as if it were trailing them. It never stopped. The shadows between the trees. It was a cold autumn evening when Clara and her boyfriend, Mark, ventured into the dense woods for a weekend camping trip. The forest was known for its secluded beauty and eerie stillness. They had no idea how right that last part would turn out to be. They set up camp near an old, abandoned logging road. The trees were thick and dark, and the air had that crisp scent of falling leaves. They built a fire and settled in for a cozy evening under the stars. But as the fire crackled, something strange began to happen. At first, it was just an odd feeling, like they weren't alone, but the thought quickly passed. Then they heard something moving in the distance, just beyond the reach of the firelight. Something large, slow-moving, like it was stalking them. "Did you hear that?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling. Mark nodded but didn't say anything. He stood up and grabbed a flashlight. "I'll check it out," he said, his voice casual, though Clara could tell he was hiding his nerves. He stepped into the trees, the light from his flashlight bouncing across the trunks of the massive pines. Clara stayed by the fire, watching him disappear into the dark. Minutes passed, then an hour. Mark didn't return. Clara's heart began to race. She called out, but her voice was swallowed by the vast forest. She tried not to panic, convincing herself that Mark was just lost in the dark. But as the night dragged on, she began to feel a sense of dread building in her chest. It wasn't just the silence, it was the shadows. They seemed to move on their own, creeping between the trees, just out of her vision. Suddenly, she saw a figure, but it wasn't Mark. It was a tall, thin shape standing between 2 massive trees, barely visible in the low light. The shape didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Clara's stomach twisted into knots. She grabbed her things and ran. She bolted for the car, praying she wasn't being followed. She never found Mark. When the search party arrived the next day, they found his flashlight, his jacket, and his boots near the spot where Clara had last seen him. But there was no sign of him anywhere. They said he must have gotten lost. But Clara knew better. She could still see the shadow between the trees. She could still hear it watching her. The last camper. Jake had been camping in the same spot for years. It was a small, remote area deep in the woods, a place where few others ever ventured. The kind of place where he could be alone with his thoughts. This time, though, something felt off. It had rained earlier in the day, and the ground was soft, the air thick with moisture. As Jake unpacked his gear near his favorite campfire spot, he noticed something strange. The area around him seemed too quiet. No birds, no wind. Just the soft sound of dripping water. He shook it off. Maybe it was just the weather. As evening set in, the quiet became unnerving. No sounds of animals, no rustling in the leaves. Just the eerie silence. He tried to focus on the crackling fire, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. That's when he heard it, a faint tapping, like something knocking on a tree. He stood up, scanning the woods. His flashlight caught nothing. But the tapping came again, louder this time, as if someone was knocking at the trunk of a nearby tree, right next to his campsite. "Hello?" Jake called out, his voice shaky, though he tried to sound calm. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the wind, which had started up again. Then, just as Jake turned back to the fire, he saw it, a figure, standing at the edge of the trees. It was a man, or at least, it looked like a man. Tall, dressed in a dark jacket, but the face was hidden beneath a white-brimmed hat. "Who's there?" Jake called out again, stepping forward, his heart racing. But the figure didn't respond. It just stood there, unmoving, like a shadow in the fading light. Jake took a step forward. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the isolation, the odd stillness of the woods, or the strange compulsion to confront whatever it was. As he got closer, the figure stepped backward, vanishing into the darkness between the trees. But Jake felt a sudden chill, a deep sense of wrongness in the air. He turned to head back to the fire, but when he looked again, the man was there, standing just a few feet behind him, smiling in a way that didn't seem human. Jake never made it home. They found his tent abandoned the next day, the fire still burning low. His boots were found near the campfire, but the rest of his gear was untouched. The rangers believed he'd left in a hurry. But those who knew the woods well said he was taken. Somewhere out there, in the deep woods, he's still there, waiting for the next camper. The Laughing Woman. Tim and his girlfriend, Rachel, had never gone camping in such a remote area. They thought it would be the perfect place for a peaceful retreat. Nestled in the quiet of the deep forest, with only the sound of the wind through the leaves, they felt completely isolated. The first night was uneventful. They cooked dinner by the fire and talked, enjoying the beauty of the untouched woods. But as the evening wore on, Rachel started hearing something faint, a soft, high-pitched giggle in the distance. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her eyes wide. Tim paused. "It's probably an animal," he said, trying to reassure her. "It could be a squirrel or a bird." But Rachel wasn't so sure. The laughter didn't sound like anything natural. It was too human. And it wasn't coming from the trees, either. It was coming from the direction of their tent. They both went inside to bed early, hoping the strange sound would go away. But it didn't. The laughter continued throughout the night, softer at first, but then louder, more distinct, like it was right outside their tent. Rachel was terrified, clinging to Tim, whispering that they needed to leave. Tim stood up and unzipped the tent. He scanned the area with his flashlight, but there was nothing there. Only the quiet, dark forest. He zipped the tent up again, but the laughter didn't stop. It grew more frantic, almost manic, echoing through the trees. They left at first light. Tim said he heard it again as they packed up, a cold, eerie laugh that seemed to come from all around them. Later, back home, they found something strange in the photos they'd taken. In the background, just behind the trees, a faint outline of a woman's face, grinning widely. The feral ones. Ethan and Carla had always loved camping, but they wanted to try something a little different this time, a secluded, primitive campsite miles off any known trail. No amenities, no other campers, just them and the wilderness. The first night, they enjoyed the peace, watching the stars and listening to the chirping of crickets. But by the second night, things changed. As they sat by the fire, Ethan thought he saw something move out of the corner of his eye, a quick, low shape darting between the trees. "Did you see that?" he whispered to Carla, who shook her head. "Probably just an animal," she said, though her voice wavered. But as the firelight danced across the forest, the strange figures began appearing more often, quick glances of shadowed shapes moving low to the ground, circling them. They decided to ignore it, but when they got into their tent, Ethan heard something strange, a low growl, then laughter, high and taunting, just beyond the fabric of the tent. He held his breath, his heart racing, trying to convince himself it was just the wind or his imagination. But the sounds didn't stop. They grew louder, closer, until he was sure he heard whispered voices in an unfamiliar language. Then, something sharp dragged slowly down the side of the tent. Carla gasped, clutching Ethan's arm as he held perfectly still. He could feel her trembling, and he whispered, "Don't move." In the faint morning light, they found their campsite trashed, their food scattered, torn open, and bite marks in the containers. The dirt was covered in footprints, barefoot, but human, with long, twisted toes that dragged deep into the ground. They packed up as fast as they could. But even as they made their way back to the car, they could feel eyes watching them, hear distant laughter in the trees, and the feeling that something just out of sight was following them, waiting for them to come back. The Knockers. Jason and his brother Lucas were camping deep in the national forest, far from any marked sites. They wanted to explore untouched land, to experience nature in its rawest form. After hiking for miles, they found a small clearing and set up camp. The first day went smoothly, and they cooked over an open flame, enjoying the solitude. But as night fell, a strange knocking sound echoed through the woods. It was steady, deliberate, and coming from the trees surrounding their campsite. "Maybe a woodpecker," Lucas suggested, but Jason shook his head. The knocks were too slow, too rhythmic. The knocking went on all night. Every so often, it would stop, only to start again a few moments later, closer to their tent. When morning came, they found nothing unusual. They assumed it was some strange natural phenomenon, but the second night, the knocking returned, louder than before. This time, it wasn't just knocks. Now they could hear shuffling, as if something were moving around their campsite. Jason unzipped the tent to look, shining his flashlight into the darkness. The knocking ceased instantly. "Who's there?" he called out, but there was no answer, only the sound of something scraping against the bark of a tree. Just as he was about to zip up the tent, he saw it, a hand, pale and thin, wrapped around the trunk of a tree just outside the light's reach. Then, another hand appeared, reaching out toward him. Before he could react, the hands pulled back into the darkness, and the knocking started again, now more frantic, more desperate, surrounding them. The brothers didn't sleep a minute that night, and at dawn, they left in a hurry. But as they hiked out, every few steps, they could hear faint knocking, following them all the way back to their car. The skin of the woods. 3 friends decided to camp in an area known for strange happenings, a patch of forest where animals never seemed to live, and where even hunters avoided. They shrugged off the stories, thinking it was all exaggeration. The first night went by without issue, but on the second night, one of the friends, Liam, wandered off to gather more firewood. Hours passed, and he still hadn't returned. They called his name, searching the area with their flashlights, but there was no sign of him. Just as they were about to give up, they heard footsteps approaching from the direction of the trees. Relieved, they turned to see him coming out of the woods, but something was wrong. He was walking stiffly, his face slack, his eyes empty. He didn't answer when they called his name. "Liam, are you okay?" one of his friends asked, approaching him carefully. Liam didn't respond. He just stood there, his head tilted oddly to the side, and his skin looked wrong. It was pale, stretched tight, like it didn't fit him anymore. Then he opened his mouth, but his voice didn't sound like him. It was low, hollow, like an echo. "It's cold. In the woods." Suddenly, he turned and walked back into the darkness, his body moving with unnatural jerks. They followed him briefly, calling his name, but he disappeared, vanishing between the trees. The next day, they searched for him with the help of a ranger, but he was gone without a trace. The only thing they found was his shirt, ripped and draped across a tree branch, his name stitched into the collar. Months later, another camper in the area reported seeing a man who looked just like Liam, wandering the forest, his skin pale, his eyes hollow, mumbling, "It's cold." In the woods. The unmarked path. Abby and her father, Dan, loved hiking and had been going on weekend camping trips for years. But this time, they decided to explore a part of the forest they'd never been to before, a remote area with no established trails. On the second day of their hike, they came across a narrow, unmarked path that seemed to cut deeper into the forest. Against his better judgment, Dan agreed to follow it, intrigued by the idea of discovering something new. The path wound through dense trees, and after a few hours, they stumbled upon something strange, a small, old campsite, with decaying tents and belongings scattered around. Everything looked untouched but abandoned, as though the people who'd been there had left in a hurry. Dan walked up to one of the tents and peered inside, and that's when he froze. There was a body, a pile of bones, half covered with dirt, lying inside the tent, dressed in torn clothes. Abby gasped, pulling him back. But then they noticed something even more disturbing. There was a journal lying on the ground nearby. Dan picked it up, flipping through the pages. It was filled with notes about the area, descriptions of strange sounds, and one chilling sentence written over and over, "They're watching me." As they backed away from the campsite, they realized they were no longer alone. Figures, tall and gaunt, were standing in the shadows, watching them from the trees, just barely visible. They turned and ran, retracing their steps as fast as they could. But the path seemed to twist and turn in ways it hadn't before. It was as if the forest itself was shifting, trying to trap them. Hours later, they stumbled out of the woods, exhausted and terrified. They never returned to that forest, and Abby's father never spoke about what he'd seen again. But every once in a while, Abby still dreams of that unmarked path. And the figures in the trees. The scent of the forest. Chris, a solo camper, had always enjoyed the quiet isolation of the deep woods. He set up camp miles from many known trails, confident he'd be entirely alone. But on his second night, he noticed something strange. A sweet, sickly smell started wafting through the trees. It smelled like flowers mixed with something sour, something rotten. Curious, he decided to follow the scent, flashlight in hand. The smell grew stronger as he moved deeper into the woods, leading him to a small clearing where he saw something bizarre, dozens of flower bouquets, all wilted, lying in a perfect circle. In the center of the circle was something he hadn't noticed at first, a small, rotting cabin, barely visible in the moonlight. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint light flickered from within. Against his better judgment, Chris crept closer. As he peeked inside, he froze. The cabin was filled with photographs pinned to the walls, hundreds of them, each one of a different person, all looking directly at the camera. And then he saw the most chilling part. In one of the photos, he saw himself, taken from behind, sitting by his campfire the night before. He ran back to his campsite, heart pounding, but when he got there, the sweet, sickly smell was everywhere. It clung to his tent, his backpack, even his clothes. And then he saw them, more photographs, scattered across the ground, each one closer than the last. Chris grabbed his things and ran, not looking back, with the scent of rotting flowers lingering in the air, following him like a curse. The Watcher in the Woods. Lena and her father were avid campers. They had a favorite spot in a remote, unmarked part of the national forest, a place her father had discovered years ago and kept secret. They'd set up camp just as the sun was setting, and Lena went to gather firewood, drifting a bit too far from their tent. That's when she heard footsteps, heavy and deliberate, snapping twigs as they moved toward her. She called out for her dad, thinking maybe he'd come to help her. But there was no reply, just those footsteps, edging closer, slow and steady. Rushing back to camp, she found her father sitting by the fire, unaware of anything unusual. She brushed it off, thinking she'd imagined it. But that night, Just as she was dozing off, she heard the footsteps again, closer now, circling their tent. Every few hours, she'd wake up to the unmistakable crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs. Her father assured her it was probably animals, raccoons, maybe. But just before dawn, something changed. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a scratching sound, right next to her head. In the weak light of dawn, she peered out of the tent to find dozens of sticks, arranged in strange shapes surrounding their camp. Each shape pointed in the same direction, toward the dense part of the woods. Her father, finally unnerved, agreed they should leave. But as they packed, Lena noticed something on her father's neck, scratches, deep and fresh, as though from claws. He insisted he hadn't felt a thing. When they reached their car, Lena glanced back at the forest and saw something moving in the trees. It wasn't animal or human, it was a pale figure, watching them. It raised a hand, and Lena noticed something dangling from its fingers, a small charm necklace her father always wore. She looked back at her father and saw it. He was still wearing it, his face pale as he looked down at his own neck. The laughter in the dark. Carter and Jen went on a weekend camping trip in a secluded forest, drawn by rumors of an abandoned ranger's cabin. They hiked for hours before they found it, half buried in vines and surrounded by trees that seemed to bend inward, blocking out the sky. They set up camp just outside the cabin, deciding to check it out in the morning. But that night, as they lay in their tent, a strange sound broke the silence. It was laughter, soft, childlike, and coming from just outside. "Did you hear that?" Jen whispered. Carter shushed her, trying to listen. The laughter grew louder, and a chorus of small voices began chanting words they couldn't make out. It felt like a game, like hide and seek. Finally, unable to bear it, Carter unzipped the tent and stepped outside, shining his flashlight toward the cabin. Shadows darted in and out of the trees, just beyond the reach of the light. But when he aimed the flashlight toward the cabin, he saw them, small, childlike figures standing just outside, watching with hollow eyes. They didn't move, didn't blink, but each one wore an expression of twisted delight. They quickly packed up and left, racing through the woods back to their car. But as they stumbled through the trees, the laughter grew louder, following them, the voices chanting, "Come play with us." They never camped again. And every so often, at night, Carter swears he can still hear the children laughing just outside his window. The Silent Hiker. A group of college friends were exploring the Appalachian woods, thrilled to be out of range of cell towers and civilization. The trail was faint, winding deep into the forest where the trees were dense and wild. As they set up their tents, a figure appeared on the trail, a tall man with a backpack and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face. The friends called out to him, but he didn't respond, just walked past them, not even glancing in their direction. They thought little of it until that night when they heard him again, his footsteps circling their camp, heavy and slow, pausing just at the edge of their firelight. The next morning, they found that each of their tents had been sliced open with something sharp. At first, they blamed animals, but none of their food was touched. Unnerved, they decided to head back. But as they started down the trail, they saw him again, standing on the path ahead, blocking their way. They shouted for him to move, but he only tilted his head, lifting his hand slowly to point deeper into the woods, where an unmarked trail twisted away from the main one. Desperate to get around him, they followed his direction. Hours later, they realized they were lost. The forest grew denser, the air colder, and that's when they heard the footsteps again, but this time, they weren't behind them. The man was ahead, waiting, watching. They were found days later, wandering aimlessly, unable to remember how they'd gotten so far off course. But each one of them had a mark carved into their skin, a single slash down their forearms, identical and precise. None of them could explain it. And each night since, when they closed their eyes, they'd see him there in the woods, pointing, always pointing them deeper,